What's up, everybody? Welcome on into this edition of Warchant TV. I'm Aslan Hajavani, joined by founder and administrator of Warchant.com, Gene Williams. If you're not a member of Warchant.com, it's the ultimate Seminoles sports source. You're missing out on a lot, even though there's not what it seems like a lot going on in the sporting world. Seminole Madness is going on with the 64 player head-to-head bracket trying to determine the best player in football history at Florida State University. Ira's got some great write-ups from the teleconference with Mike Norvell. We had a one-on-one interview with Devontae Love-Taylor, the offensive line transfer from FIU, on the end of the Wake Up Warchant podcast from Wednesday, I think it was. So lots going on. And one of the most popular things, Gene, that's been going on, also use the promo code WARCHANT30 if you're not a member. Try it out for 30 days, like I did back in 2003, and you'll like it. You'll never leave. But I think one of the most popular things that we've actually done here in recent memory in the last few weeks or so, Gene, was the 2002 Recruiting Retrospective. So you're back to help us out with 2003. And 2003, a trend was starting to develop. 2001 was that sort of setback hiccup, but everybody thought they would reload in 2002. Pretty sure they were preseason top 5. Went down to the wire against Iowa State out in Kansas City in week 1 of the 2002 season, and that season did not work out as planned either. So 2003 was a make or break sort of year for Florida State, definitely in recruiting.
Yeah, there was a little bit. Still, you kind of had the feeling there was always this, they're really close to getting there. I mean, you remember that year they still won the ACC. You had, I think that was the end of year 2002. They played Georgia in the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah.
And that was where they didn't have a quarterback. Talman Gardner dropped what should have been the touchdown that probably wins the game for them. You still felt, look, they were really close. You get a couple recruits here and there. You're right back to where you ought to be. So, I mean, that was where recruiting really comes in to get those players at key positions, like a quarterback, like offensive line, some positions that are really weak at the years before, so they really need to load up there. Obviously, they did not, but talk about it here, they did end up signing the number 1 recruit in the country.
And that's what pulled me into Warchant.com back in 2003, 17 years ago, Gene, was I'd been introduced to the website when the whole Adrian McPherson fiasco was going on late in 2002, and I kind of lingered around on the boards. And then when I saw these recruiting stories about a homegrown kid like Antonio Cromartie from Lincoln High School thinking about going to Florida, and then the number 1 overall recruit, Ernie Sims, here in Tallahassee thinking about going to Georgia, I was like, this cannot happen. Those two fantastic high school recruits is what really pulled me into Warchant.com, and those two kids meant everything to that 2003 class.
Yeah, it was really top-heavy. I mean, we talked about that a little bit, but, I mean, you got 2 of the best recruits in the country, and they're right in Tallahassee. What's scary looking back at that, you may remember that, Aslan, how close it was with those 2 guys. I mean, starting with Sims, who was the only player in history for Florida State that was the number 1 overall recruit in the country that they signed, at least according to Rivals. And it came down to the wire for that kid. And a lot of people thought back then, if not for Kevin Steele being hired, remember Joe Kimes was a linebacker coach at the time. The talk was he was really not hitting it off with Ernie Sims, and he was looking hard at Georgia. He was looking at Auburn. Miami was in there. So it was really scary for a lot of people around the time. And then a week before his visit, FSU hired Kevin Steele. And those 2 really kind of hit it off, and I think that was the difference that got him to go ahead. And he waited till National Signing Day. There was a lot of suspense. Same thing that Antonio Cromartie mentioned, Florida. Florida was very much in the mix. Ron Zook had gotten there. And say what you want about his coaching prowess. I want to talk about more about Ron Zook in a little bit, but, boy, he could recruit. And he really, that one came down the wire, too. So they were able to get those 2 guys. Ernie had a real nice career at Florida State. Maybe not elite, but I'd say pretty solid. Got, at least 1 year as an ESPN first-team All-American. Ended up being a first-round draft pick for Florida State. What's crazy about Cromartie to me is you realize, Aslan, he only started 1 game at Florida State.
Right. Was it against Miami? Was it 2004 against Miami?
He came in. I think it was in the bowl game of his sophomore year because there was an injury, and he came in and started that game. But it's crazy because then he goes out in that spring practice that next year, just dominates. One of the most dominating spring practice I've ever seen by a player. I think he only gave up, in all the scrimmages, gave up 1 catch for like 5 yards. He was just, nobody could throw against him at all. And was going to be the breakout guy that next year. And then a month before the season in a summer workout, blew out his ACL. So he missed that entire season and then ends up going pro. First-round draft pick. I think he played 3 Pro Bowls. So he had a very outstanding NFL career, but really never made a real impact at Florida State.
And the crazy thing about all this, too, Gene, was the fact that towards the end of the 2002 season, things obviously were not going in the right direction or the direction that Florida State fans or Florida fans had hoped for. But Florida State took the Gators to the woodshed in Tallahassee in 2002. True freshman Leon Washington, 5-star, really burst onto the scene in that game. So it seemed like, Florida State still had a better brand. They had been to a national title game much more recently. They'd won a national title much more recently than Florida. But when it came down to signing day, which was only that February, it just did not seem to go Florida State's way when that came down to it.
Yeah, that's really crazy when you go back and look at that time and you explore the landscape of where Florida State was. Like I said, they were close. You still had Bobby Bowden as your head coach. You were still winning the ACC. You still were just a couple of years removed for playing for a national championship. While Florida, Spurrier left a couple of years before Ron Zook, really didn't do much his first year. I think they were 8-5 that year, so not really a big name. You would think Florida State would absolutely own them. Like you said, they beat them badly the year before. They beat them 4 out of 5 seasons going into that. But it was no contest recruiting. Florida came in and just wiped the floor up with Florida State. And a lot of that, and part of it, I will give credit to Ron Zook because he changed the landscape for recruiting back then. He came in and he started recruiting guys super early, sophomores, juniors, getting offers left and right, aggressively recruiting. And now the other side of it was, and remember at the time, Florida State had it down pat with Bobby Bowden. They'd evaluate guys a little bit. You have them in the summer camp. Then Bobby Bowden would go in December, January, make those in-home visits and close the recruitment. The problem was back then, Ron Zook had been recruiting a guy for a year and a half, and then all of a sudden it was too late to get in on these guys. So it really changed how Florida State had to recruit, and they had to react to Ron Zook. And the other side of it too was, and I don't know if you remember the story I did back then. You remember did FSU get Zooked? I don't know if you remember that story.
Yeah.
Raised a lot of ire back in the day. Had some quotes from some recruits, some parents, some high school coaches about some of the tactics he would pull. He'd promise basically anything to kids. There was infamous that Florida supposedly sent up negative press clippings of Florida State, some of the off-field stuff, some of the Adrian McPherson things, some things about Darnell Dockett to various recruits. So it was really the first time we saw somebody really underhanded recruiting tactics against another school. And hey, credit to him, it worked. And that Florida ended up, depending on what service you looked at, I mean, some had them as a number 1 recruiting class. They signed 5 5-star recruits in 2003, and that was kind of that set the stage for the Urban Meyer years. He started building that talent up, so when Urban Meyer came in, he had all that talent there, and obviously we know what he did from there. So really, you go back to this year, it really kind of changed the landscape in college football in the state of Florida.
There was guys like Joe Cohen. I know that was a head-to-head battle for Florida State with them in Florida. Marcus Thomas, I think a defensive tackle from Jacksonville that absolutely loved Odell. I think Chad Jackson, a wide receiver, was another guy. And Florida State seemed to lose out on those guys, near misses, if you will. But then around the nation, there were some even bigger prospects in terms of national notoriety. Maybe none bigger than Jamarcus Russell. Kid from Alabama. They somehow got him on campus. And then Lorenzo Booker's best friend from the left coast over in California, Whitney Lewis, was a guy that really introduced me. You'd been doing it for years, obviously, Gene, but I got my first sort of taste about the politics, if you will, of the household when it comes to recruiting and signing day with the recruitment of Whitney Lewis.
What a couple crazy stories. I mean, that's the thing, you look back at these classes, they're so much fun to talk about what happened. I remember back then they would have the recruiting banquet. It was such a big deal back then. It was their football bank was their big day in recruiting. You'd have a lot of former players come in. It was a big time in town for all this, and it was actually open to the public. So you go there and eat while all these recruits are there and watch the football banquet. And you could see, I'm sitting a couple tables away from Jamarcus Russell and Whitney Lewis. And that was the infamous night where those guys with Lorenzo Booker just all clicked. They had a great time. And we had heard from various sources that they both silently committed to Bobby Bowden that evening, both Jamarcus Russell and Whitney Lewis. So you're thinking this is going to be an elite recruiting class. It's going to take off. Well, then Jamarcus Russell the next week visited LSU, and at the time, I know your favorite coach, Jimbo Fisher, was the offensive coordinator there at the time, and they had a pretty good head coach there too, in Nick Saban. They were able to talk Jamarcus Russell into going ahead and switching and going to LSU. We know the rest is history. Say what you want about him in the NFL. He had an unbelievable college career for LSU. And then Whitney Lewis, you want to talk about craziness, a kid who, he wanted desperately to come to Florida State. It was his favorite school. His best friend was Lorenzo Booker. On National Signing Day, his mother would refuse to sign the letter of intent. And so he got, mother strong-armed him into going ahead and signing with USC, where he turned out to be one of the all-time busts in recruiting history. And he showed up overweight, was unmotivated. Again, I don't know whether that was because he was forced to go to a school he really didn't want to, or he just wouldn't have panned out anyway. But here's a kid who's 220 pounds and poorly ran in the 4.3, set all kind of records in the state of California for receiving and rushing, was just an elite athlete at the time. So really, this is one of those what could have been if Florida State could have gotten those two guys in this class.
And then when we go back in this sort of, fun-loving autopsy we're doing of looking back at the past year, Gene, it's The one thing that kind of, stands out is I look at kind of the class itself, taking the 5,000 foot above ground look is just the numbers just, there weren't a whole lot of players in that class. And that kind of was a foreboding of things to come from Florida State, no?
Yeah, I think because they lost out, they missed out so many close battles down the stretch, they just ended up signing. I mean, I think they had 20 commitments, but they ended up having only 18 signees. And this wasn't a class where you were short on scholarship. They undersigned. They probably could have got close to 25. And then when you factor in 4 members of that class didn't qualify. So for all intents and purposes, you had 14 signees in a class where you could have signed 25. That is a huge self-imposed probation. You can't undersign, sign another 7 or 8 offensive linemen, take a few flyers on some running backs and linebackers. Do something. So, that was a major fail by the coaching staff at the time. You can undersign by 2 or 3. You can't undersign by 10. It's unheard of in recruiting.
Absolutely amazing. Some of the guys that they had to end up then, some of the guys they had towards the end of it to patch that class together, Gene, was just a pretty crazy. Guys like DJ Norris, Jermaine McElroy. A lot of these guys that was like, where do they come from? And I think this was kind of the tough lesson that a lot of folks learned about. Just trust the coach. They know what they're doing. But a lot of these guys kind of seemed like they were being grasped for, when things came towards the end of it. So, ultimately, though, Gene, how does a team that, had been dominating their in-state rival in Florida, had only been now, 2003 or only, 3 years, not even 3 full years, removed from playing in a national title game, playing in 3 of them in a row? How did they get to that point, do you think?
Yeah, really, I think this class is symptomatic of the bigger problem that had happened. I mentioned some of the stuff, the recruiting had changed, the way Ron Zook was able to come in and kind of do stuff. But it takes 2 to tango here. It wasn't just what Florida did. It's the shortcomings Florida State had, and that's really in the coaching staff. We all know the really poor hires Bobby Bowden had back then, starting with Jeff Bowden, and we'd heard the stories back then in recruiting that, say what you want as not being a very good offensive coordinator, but you'd heard stories that he really was not very dynamic with recruits. He didn't really hit it off with parents or high school coaches, so he just was a liability, frankly, in recruiting. And then some of the I mentioned Joe Kynes, who got replaced by Kevin Steele. Jody Allen was another one. Here's a guy who's a GA, really had very little experience in terms of major coaching at college. It was a GA at Florida State, and then when that job came open, the defensive ends, instead of going out and hiring Bobby could hire whoever he wanted at the time probably. They promote a guy who was unproven to that defensive end position and that defensive end coach, and I think that was a poor hire as well. And just it goes on and on with all the poor hires he made back then. So I think that was reflecting itself in recruiting. Frankly, you had a coaching staff that was getting a little bit older too, and it's a young man's game in recruiting. You got to have a lot of energy to go out there, and that's one thing Ron Zook and that staff did, and they had a ton of energy. They went out there, recruited aggressively. They went all over the country, and it paid off for them that year. You got to give them credit for that. Now, again, some of the tactics a little underhanded potentially, but at the same point, they definitely outworked Florida State.
And you mentioned it earlier that it takes kind of 2 things to occur. It's 2 opposing forces either moving away from each other or colliding, and it's Florida State's 2003 class would be the underclassmen that would have to go up against Urban Meyer when he arrived in Gainesville, and this kind of set the stage for what ultimately became the teeth of that lost decade, right?
Well, yeah, look at what's crazy. Look at the next 4 years between 2003 and 2006. The win-loss record goes down every single year for the next 4 years. Obviously that is directly. 2003 was not a bad season. Of course, we all know what happened down in Gainesville with the fun PK Sam catch and Chris Ricks, Dominic Robinson, all that fun stuff down there, and they were able to do that. But that was based primarily on the guys they'd signed a couple of years earlier. Once that group had started to move on and you started to rely on classes like this when they went to 2004, 5, and 6, man, things really started to unravel for Florida State, and that's when they really became the 3rd team in the state. And we really started to have what we saw, the Wake Forest debacle of a couple of years after that. This really was the unraveling of Florida State and the emergence of the so-called lost decade.
Right. Probably no greater point to illustrate the importance of X's and O's, but really Jimmy's and Joe's when we go back and look at what the 2003 class was. So, Gene, will you be back? Will we do 2004? We're going to keep marching this thing down to the goal line?
Yeah, let's do it, man. Unless you want to jump around a little bit, but I say let's just go chronological order. We'll get this thing up to, at least we'll get up to maybe the early Jimbo years, because that'll be fun when things get positive again. We can't end on a negative note, so I'd say at least that 2010, 2011, 2012. I think we got to talk about those classes at least.
Definitely. We'll do so. So Gene Williams will join us as we look further ahead into the Florida State recruiting vault. We'll go back probably to 2004 the next time we get back together with you folks. So check out warchant.com. Stay connected. If you're not a member, use the promo code WARCHANT30. 30 for days of access. Try it. You'll be like me. You'll be around forever, hopefully. He's Gene. I'm Aslan. Thanks for watching.